All right, let's get started. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Justin D'Souza. I'm a quantitative specialist here at Statistic Solutions. During today's webinar, we will be discussing how to construct quantitative research questions and hypotheses. I will be going through the whole presentation first, and I will do a question and answer session at the end. So if you have any questions, please type those in the chat box or the question and answer box. My colleague Isaides will be assisting with questions as well pertaining to the services that our company provides. So if you have any questions, you can use the chat box or the question and answer box. I'll start out by giving a brief overview of the services that our company provides. Then we will discuss today's topic regarding construction of research questions and hypotheses, breaking it down by different research designs. So exploratory, correlational, experimental, all the different types of common designs. We'll conclude with a summary and a question and answer session. Our company, Statistic Solutions, provides assistance with every part of the dissertation process. So our company has both methodologist specialists and literature review specialists. So if you've hit a roadblock in a particular area or maybe a group of chapters altogether, you can reach out to us for assistance. We provide edits to your paper so we can help you address committee feedback. We can help analyze and crunch your numbers in SPSS or our company software Intellectus. We follow APA format, and we can even APA edit your entire paper. So this is a list of all the different components that we assist with. If you've hit a roadblock and you do need assistance, please give us a call at 727-442-4290. And we will be sending everyone a copy of the presentation today, along with a copy of the recording of the webinar. This slide, I have a couple links for the past webinars that we've conducted and the future webinars we will be doing. So you can take a look at those. So to start out with today's topic of developing research questions and hypotheses, it's good to lay the foundation for what quantitative and qualitative research are and what's the difference. So quantitative, as you can hear the word quant, implies that we're looking at numbers. We're assigning numerical values to our data, and this usually involves running statistics. Inferential statistics or descriptive statistics. So it's looking for correlations or associations between variables, maybe looking at differences in variables between groups. That's when you typically want to use quantitative research. Qualitative research is using open-ended responses, exploring phenomena that have deeper themes or deeper meaning that a multiple choice response could not provide. So this usually involves running interviews with participants or having people write open-ended responses. So there isn't as much qualitative examination or not as much quantitative examination when you're just looking at quality. You're trying to explore phenomenon, and typically, you have to run an interview to understand that phenomenon. Okay, so before even jumping into research questions, you have to take a dive into the literature. So you need to identify a gap in the literature, something that has not been examined before. And that may be one of the toughest steps, is finding something unique that has not been conducted in research before. One of my most straightforward suggestions for doing this, if you're trying to adopt a topic or you're trying to mirror a previous study, is try to localize your project to a particular location that can make your study unique, or maybe examining particular demographics, so comparing between gender, ethnicity in a particular location. Once you centralize your study to a different location, that does make it unique. So that's kind of a simple way to get around replicating a study, centralizing it to a particular location. So that should be one of the first steps, is you need to conduct a review of the literature to identify your research problem and your research objective. After identifying the research problem, you then want to create a list of all the variables of interest. Now, this is assuming you've decided to go in a quantitative direction. We don't think a qualitative direction or a mixed method study is what we need. We just want to examine our variables quantitatively or statistically. So you want to be able to operationalize all your variables. So something like gender, male and female, when you run the numbers, you can assign 1 and 2 to male and female as opposed to just using male and female. You can assign numbers to all your data. Everything needs to be numerically measurable. So at this step, you want to identify, are you using a self-report survey or are you going to use archival data? So a self-report survey involves you administering a survey to participants. Maybe you can use something like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, target participants. You can also use archival or secondary data. That may save you some time. So finding a spreadsheet that already exists. The thing I would try to avoid is creating your own survey from scratch, because that can involve a pilot test and proving that that survey is reliable and valid. And that can just add several months to the process. So try to find a self-report survey that is already previously validated or use archival secondary data. Here are the 4 most common research designs I see used today in academic research. So we have descriptive exploratory design, which is maybe the most straightforward design. We have correlational designs. We have experimental, quasi-experimental, and causal comparative. Those all kind of go hand in hand. And we have longitudinal designs, which can also be lumped into experimental designs. So we will cover each of these and provide sample research questions that would go with each of these designs. Starting out with a descriptive or exploratory design. So this is used when you're just trying to identify trends in a sample. You're not necessarily trying to prove or disprove hypotheses. You're not looking at relationships of interest or trying to test for differences. So this isn't using statistics like ANOVAs, t-tests, regressions. This is just using frequencies and percentages to summarize your data, maybe examining demographics and a Likert scale survey and seeing how people responded. So for a sample research question like this, you would just ask, what are the trends in whatever factor you're looking at? What are the trends in job satisfaction among teaching faculty? What is the most predominant leadership style used among managers? Notice that we're not saying what is the relationship between constructs or are there differences. It's just a general examination of trends. So this is what would be a descriptive or exploratory research question. Sometimes committees are not on board with this because it's too simplistic. Others are. I've seen both sides of the equation where some committees say you need to have inferential statistics, meaning you need to do correlations or regressions. But I would give this a try. You know, the goal of a dissertation should be to get through it as efficiently as possible. We're not trying to add months to the process. That means you have to pay more tuition. So try to start out simplistic and If your committee's not on board, then expand it a little bit further and add correlations and tests, things like that. So the second design is a correlational design, and correlational design is at the top of the pyramid, and it branches off into two possibilities. You have correlational analyses and you have regression analyses. The correlational analyses are looking at two-way associations between your variables of interest, meaning you don't need to have an independent and dependent variable. You just have two variables of interest. So a sample research question here is, what is the relationship or association between X and Y? So notice the difference here between this correlation question and our previous question. So our previous descriptive question was just looking at one variable at a time, job satisfaction, leadership style. Once you get into correlational designs, you have two variables of interest at least. So the sample, is there a significant relationship between age and self-efficacy, or is there a significant association between education and job position? So from here, you can then write your data analysis plan to reflect what specific test am I going to use to address these questions. If you have all continuous data, then you can run Pearson correlation. And that would address sample question 1 right here. Hypothetically, say you give a fill in the blank response for age, so you know specifically what people's age is, and then you also know self-efficacy through a Likert scale survey. These would both be continuous variables, so you can run a Pearson correlation. A Spearman correlation is the non-parametric version of a Pearson correlation. So it can be used when the assumptions of normality are not met. It can also be used when you have an ordinal variable. So something like education. Education is an ordinal variable because it has a natural progression to it. High school, bachelor's, master's, doctorate. Goes up the ladder, so it's ordinal. So you can do a Spearman correlation when you have ordinal items. When you have nominal variables, two nominal variables, meaning two categorical variables that don't have hierarchy to them, something like gender and ethnicity. You have male, female, and then ethnicity would be white, black, Asian, Hispanic. If you're testing the relationship between two categorical variables, then you can use a chi-square test of independence. So those are the three most common correlational analyses. On this slide, I have a couple examples of hypotheses. So underneath each research question, you need to have hypotheses. Typically, you need to have a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. That's what the 0 stands for, the null and alternative. 99% of the time, we are trying to reject our null hypothesis. So the null is saying that there is not a significant relationship between age and self-efficacy. Usually in research, you're trying to prove that there is a relationship. So we're ultimately trying to disprove this statement or reject our null hypothesis, which in turn means we are supporting the alternative. Okay, that same logic, I have the hypotheses listed for every research question coming up. That same logic applies. So you'll just use there is not, and then there is, for the null and alternative respectively. So the second part of a correlational design, remember I said a correlational design is at the top of the pyramid and it branches off into correlational analyses and predictive analyses. So this is the predictive side of it. So prediction implies using a regression model. We have independent variables and we have dependent variables. Independent variables are often called predictors, and dependent variables are often called criterion variables. So a regression is trying to take a series of predictors and see how it predicts a particular outcome. So I have some sample questions here. Just a very general one. Is there a significant predictive relationship between X and Y? Now, you could add more predictors. Assume X is your predictor and Y is your outcome. You could add multiple predictor variables here, and you can still run a regression model that way. So we have 3 sample questions here. Is there a significant predictive relationship between age and self-efficacy? Do emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment significantly predict academic performance? So that's an example of multiple research or multiple predictors here. Is there a significant predictive relationship between GPA and passing and failing of an exam? Those are, you just need to have that predictive word in there, and that implies regression models, okay? So at the bottom here, I have 4 bullet points for different types of regression models. The type of regression model you run is 100% contingent on your dependent variable. So if you have a continuous dependent variable, you can run a linear regression. And if you have multiple predictors, like in research question 2 here, it's called a multiple linear regression. Logistic regression, specifically a binary logistic regression, is used when predicting an outcome that is dichotomous. So a dichotomous variable is a variable that has 2 possibilities, such as sample question 3, passing and failing an exam. That's your outcome variable. Then you can do a binary logistic regression. Multinomial is taking that idea of a categorical outcome and just expanding it. So you need to have at least 3 groups, 3 or more groups to run a multinomial logistic regression. So say you were trying to predict ethnicity, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic. If that was your outcome, then you can do a multinomial logistic regression. A ordinal logistic regression is used when you have an ordinal dependent variable. So something like education, as I mentioned earlier, education is ordinal because it has a natural progression to it, but it's still categorical. It's not strictly numeric. High school, bachelor's, master's, PhD. That's when you would use an ordinal logistic regression. Or if you're just looking at a individual Likert scale item, something that says strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. If that's your outcome, you can use an ordinal logistic regression as well. Here are the sample hypotheses. Similar logic, you just say there is not and there is a significant predictive relationship. The next research design is experimental, quasi-experimental, causal, comparative. So these are testing for differences in variables between groups. So it's not predictive, it's not correlational. You're taking a variable and you want to test for differences between groups. So you have an independent variable, which is your grouping factor, and you have a dependent variable, which is what you're trying to test for differences in. Okay, so an experimental-based question is going to have this format. Is there a significant difference in your dependent variable between the groups of your independent variable? Notice that our X and Y have shifted, so our dependent is listed first and our independent is listed second. We have some sample questions here. So is there a significant difference in job satisfaction between treatment and control? Is there a significant difference in self-efficacy based on race? Are there significant differences in emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment by race? And taking that same idea of RQ3 and adding a control variable. Okay, so here are the 4 common techniques statistically to analyze these questions. Research question 1 has 2 groups of comparison, treatment and control, and it has 1 dependent variable, job satisfaction. Assuming that job satisfaction is a continuous dependent variable, we would run an independent sample t-test right here. The sample question 2, the difference here is that we have an independent variable with 3 or more groups. We have race. So instead of a t-test, which can only use 2 groups, we run an ANOVA, an analysis of variance, and that can contain or compare 3 or more groups. A MANOVA is a multivariate analysis of variance, and that's used when you have multiple dependent variables that are measured continuously. So sample question 3 is an example of that. We have 3 dependent variables right here: exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. And race has 3 or more possibilities. The final option is an ANCOVA or a MANCOVA. So that's an analysis of covariance or a multivariate analysis of covariance. So the C stands for covary or covariance. That's testing for differences in variables between groups while controlling for another factor. And that would apply to sample question 4. Sample question 4, we would run a MANCOVA for that one because we have multiple dependent variables. We have an independent variable with 3 or more groups, and we have a control variable. So that would be a MANCOVA. Here are the sample hypotheses. The final design type is a longitudinal design. So a longitudinal design is assessing for differences over time. This is typically a pre and post type study. So if you're doing time periods, maybe an intervention in the middle, and you want to see, are there differences in your measurement before and after the intervention? That is when a longitudinal design comes into play. There can be an overlap here with experimental designs, and that's if you're doing something like a treatment and control group, you have an intervention, and then you have a post-test. So there are 2 moving parts here. You have time, you have pre-test, post-test, and then you have a comparison between treatment and control. So there can be an overlap with experimental designs. These are the sample questions for a longitudinal design. Is there a significant difference in knowledge between pre-test and post-test of an educational intervention? Sample question 2 just adds an additional time point. So instead of just pre-test and post-test, we also have a follow-up. And the third question here is looking at differences over time and between treatment and control groups. Sample question 1 can be addressed with a dependent or paired sample t-test. They mean the same thing, dependent sample t-test or paired sample t-test. So for a t-test, just a t-test in general, you need to have 2 points in time or 2 groups of comparison. So sample question 1 is just pre-test and post-test. We would do a paired sample t-test there. When you add an additional time point, then you do a repeated measures ANOVA. So this is baseline, post-test, and follow-up. If you have 3 or more points in time that you are comparing, that is when you do a repeated measures ANOVA. This final question may be the most complicated. So is there a difference in knowledge over time and between groups? So imagine that we have a pre and post. We have a pre-test, intervention, post-test, and we have experimental and control groups. You can use a mixed model ANOVA to test for differences over time and between groups. And here are the sample hypotheses. So the hypotheses for that final question, the one that uses a mixed model ANOVA, it really has three sets of hypotheses. So you have what's called a within effect, you have a between effect, and you have an interaction effect. So the within effect is asking for differences over time. The between effect is looking for differences between groups, and the interaction effect is simultaneously looking for differences over time and between groups. So to kind of visualize that, you have treatment pre-test, treatment post-test, control pre-test, and control post-test. So you have four possibilities of time and group. So that's what this interaction effect is checking. Okay, so that covers the four designs and the different research questions that can encompass those. So just to reiterate, you want to first identify your problem statement and find a gap in the literature. Then you want to pinpoint whether a quantitative or qualitative approach is best, potentially even a mixed method study, although I would caution against doing that because it does add more time to the process, because you might have to give a survey and then do interviews with participants. So it can make the study much longer to complete. Then you want to identify your variables of interest and pinpoint, are they nominal, ordinal, or interval measurements? You'll want to figure out if you're going to collect data with the survey. So primary data is a survey, or secondary data is archival data, spreadsheet that already exists. Try to avoid developing your own survey if you can. Once we start the question and answer session, I will provide a hyperlink to find surveys out there. Then you want to identify your research design. So are you using exploratory, correlational, experimental, or longitudinal? Develop your research questions and the hypotheses following the respective design, and then pinpoint what analyses you're going to use to address those questions. So I'll now open the webinar for questions. I do see we have some in the chat box and Q&A box, so I'll take a look at those. If you've hit a roadblock in your dissertation, please give us a call at 727-442-4290 for a free consultation. Also email us at info@statisticsolutions.com. Let's see if we have any questions. Looks like there were some issues with the audio early on. Hopefully those were resolved. Okay, so we do have a question about self-report surveys. How do I find those? So let's go into this hyperlink here. I'll put this in the chat box. Okay, so MIDS is a great website for finding previously validated surveys. So say you just put in search items or a search for your topic. So for instance, if I just put stress in here, it's going to return multiple surveys that are previously validated about stress. So I can click this one here, the PSS. It gives you key references, the background in which it was used, and then it gives you psychometrics as well. And if you're lucky enough, they'll even give you the actual survey. So you can download the document into Microsoft Word. So this is the PSS to measure perceived stress, 14 items. And there's also scoring instructions. So this one's really great. They don't always have scoring instructions. You may have to reach out to the authors of the original instrument to figure out how to score it. But this one does have the instructions, and it tells you what items need to be reverse coded and stuff like that. So I would check out that website. Another way to find surveys is going onto Google and say same thing, perceived stress, then type NCBI at the end. That is going to give you a list of previously validated articles that will talk about instruments. Okay. So here it's going to provide validity on the instrument. Has it been proven to be reliable, which it has right here. We have internal consistency measurements and Cronbach alpha. That's something you'll really want to look out for is Cronbach alpha. Okay, so let me put these in the chat box. There's the MIDS link, and then NCBI is what you want to type on Google if looking for a tool. Okay, so that's in the chat box. Let's see if we have any other questions. So we have a question from Dr. Martha. What research design would it be if you want to test and utilize treatment guidelines which have not been used in your location? Okay, so I would need to know a little more information there. What is the measurement here? You want to test and utilize treatment guidelines which have not been used. So you need to find out a way of identifying whether the guidelines are useful or not. So that there has to be an objective, or not objective, potentially objective, but most likely a subjective measurement to see if these are useful or not. And it sounds like it would be potentially a pre-test and post-test. Yeah. I think you would have to do an experimental type study there, not necessarily treatment and control groups, but you would need to have a baseline for how these guidelines have been followed in the past, and then you need to have a comparison post-test. So that may be a longitudinal design. Okay, do we have any other questions? Please type those in the chat box if you have any questions. Just to show the upcoming webinars we will be doing. So it looks like next week we're doing a full quantitative methodology webinar. We are doing a chapter 1 webinar and then a chapter 4 webinar. And so my colleague David will be doing this one about the methodology. My colleague Tom will be doing the introduction chapter, and David again will be doing quantitative results. All right, looks like we have some more questions. So what test would be used for home medication documentation and EMRs? So there's not enough information there to know what test to use. Do you have two variables of interest that are part of here? It could be correlational, it could be predictive. I would need to know a little bit more information You have the research questions developed already? Emmanuel asks, can you please repeat the process for the site for the data survey before you proceeded to the Google and CBI? Yeah, so I put the link mids.org, just in case you didn't see that. I'll put it again in the chat box. So there it is. So what you want to do is go to this website, mids.org. This is what it looks like. And this is assuming before you even come here, you need to have an idea of the topic. You need to know what variables you're trying to measure. And using a keyword, you can search for particular instruments. So I just put stress, a very general term, maybe job satisfaction, another one. So then they don't have job satisfaction specifically in here, but they have different satisfaction instruments. Okay, so then you can click one of these and they give you background and psychometrics on the tool. And it looks like the instrument will be uploaded at the bottom or attached at the bottom for some of them. Okay. Good question from Kimberly. Is it fair to assume that qualitative research is easier? Why do some assume this? You see, I would argue it's the opposite, but I definitely favor quantitative research. I'm more of a numbers guy. I think quantitative research is more efficient as you're using closed-ended responses on a survey typically, and there's only a finite number of analyses you can run. Qualitative research does require less people, so you could potentially use 5 to 10 participants and just interview them. But you could be going through pages and pages of a recording of the interview that you then have to thematize and find common themes and what the people are saying. I think it takes a lot more work to do qualitative personally. Quantitative is you're just trying to prove or disprove a hypothesis, and there's one analysis that is going to be appropriate. So I would definitely say quantitative is more efficient. Yep, Pascal, the recording will be sent to everyone. Okay, I will be providing targeted education to nurses and then measuring the outcome on the home medical compliance scores. The independent variable is the targeted education. Is this a pre-test and post-test, or is it just measured at one point in time after the targeted education? So if it's pre and post, just measured after, okay. You may have to do exploratory analysis there. Let's see. Can you explain accuracy of the home med list a little bit more? Is that a percentage you can gather? I think you're going to be listed, or you're going to be limited to descriptives potentially there. So I do cover that on this slide. Okay, so your sample question would be something like, what is the accuracy of the home med list after a targeted education to nurses? And then you'll just have to use frequencies and percentages or means and standard deviations to summarize those percentages of accuracy. Because you don't have another variable of interest, it's just accuracy. I don't think you can do correlations unless there's more than just accuracy, unless there are other subscales you can measure. So Compliance scores. Okay. So compliance scores, if compliance scores has more than just accuracy, then maybe you can do correlations. Why don't you go ahead and copy and paste your research question? Okay, this might be a case where you might want to just, you can reach out to Janine. Give us a call at this number and we can schedule a call to discuss this more. Typing through Skype or yeah, through Zoom rather, it's going to be difficult for me to figure out best analysis. It's kind of like I have to see specifically what you're looking at. And if you have the data or a sample data set, that'll make it even more clear. Okay, sounds good. All right, do we have any other questions? I think I addressed all the questions before this. Any other questions about research questions, analyses? What is the best analysis to run? Yep, you're welcome, John. Thanks for joining. Okay, I'll stay on for a few more minutes if we have any additional questions. Thank you, Dr. Banda. I appreciate that. Thanks, April. Great, Kimberly. Just starting the PhD. Do you already have a topic in mind, and do you have research questions developed? Awesome. Well, if you ever hit a roadblock, let us know. Let us know. We can certainly help you. We have specialists that focus on every part of the dissertation. We have a question from Doniva. Apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. I think we already did do a qualitative one recently. Let me see if I can find it in the archive. We do have a qualitative results chapter one there, right here. Okay, so you are going to receive a copy of this webinar, but let me just include the link for the archive. Okay, there's the link for the archive. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology. This was done by my colleague, Rachel, and she's great. I'm sure she'll answer a lot of questions in there that you may have. I would like to study the impact of a training that I've developed. Specifically, it is a training for educators and law enforcement regarding disabilities. Would this be a pre and post training comparison? That's what it sounds like. Yeah, you just have to know definitively, are you doing a pre-test? So regarding disabilities, do you have a previously validated survey that's measuring perceptions of disabilities? Okay. It does sound like a pre and post. But yeah, take a look. You know, if you go in the website I provided, you just put disabilities. You know, I don't know specifically what you're looking for in terms of a disability survey, but you can take a look on that database and also use the NCBI suggestion as well. I'm sure you can find something out there. Thanks for joining us, Lisa. Do we also provide supervision support to PhD students in partnership with the university? I believe we do. Unfortunately, I can't answer that question specifically. That would be a question for my manager. So you can speak with Janine if you have specific questions about where we can provide support and if you're partnered with the university. Aruna, yes, we have done quantitative methods before. So here is our archive. It is the second one down here. So I did provide that link in the chat box, and that was done by my colleague, David. So he covers quantitative methods. Sounds good, Lisa. Let us know if you have any questions. All right, do we have any other questions? I'll stay on for a few more minutes. Any final questions? If there isn't a survey that's already been validated, then what? So it's a little tricky. I did talk about this during the presentation that you have to prove that that survey is reliable if you develop your own. So you have to run a pilot test with a group of maybe 10 people to make sure that they can interpret the questions and that it's measuring what the survey intends. Then you need to prove that it's a valid survey. Okay, so you have to do things like confirmatory factor analysis or equation modeling. So it just adds a lot more time to the process. So I would really suggest looking for something that's already validated. But if you have no other option, then you can create your own survey. Some schools are more stringent about it in the process and that they make it more efficient. Some schools will make it a very efficient process. Others really draw it out and it can take extra months to complete that validation step. Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Do we have any final questions? Great. Thanks for joining, everyone. Like I said, we're doing a few webinars next week. I believe there were 3 of them. Yep, so Wednesday and Thursday, we have 3 webinars altogether, and we do 8 webinars a month. So come join us again if you have any questions. One final question we do have here. Can you employ correlational method using cause and effect without an experiment? I would say no. Correlational methods and correlational analyses do not imply cause and effect. I believe you would have to do an experiment to really link that cause and effect component. So correlations do not imply cause and effect. So I would probably label it experimental or causal comparative instead. Correlation does not imply causation. Okay. All right, everyone, have a great evening. Come join us again, and please give us a call if you have any questions. Have a great evening. Take care.